Welcome to Bickerstaff Bows. What we're hoping to show you is a little bit about how a bow is made. First of all, the most important thing is that we have timber stored for between 3 and 5 years, slowly and steadily seasoning, ready for use. Some of the wood arrives in the form of a log. This is the best way to use timber because you can split it such that it splits along the grain of the wood, the grain running radially across the log. Hopefully it'll split clean and true, and most of the best wood does. And when the log is split, you can see how the grain runs from one end to the other. Hickory is probably one of our most important woods as it tends to back almost all of the bows we make. If you look down the length of the log, you can see where the bark was. There is a fine fibrous layer called the cambium layer. The fibres in that indicate what direction the grain is in the log. In this section we're going to look at how we actually cut the hickory board into laminations. Looking at the end of the board, you can see the centre of the log has got knots and pins and wild grain with the pith line in it. So the first cut is to separate the board into two down what is clearly going to be waste. We then take the single growth ring off the edge of the board very carefully because that's a very valuable piece. We'll then cut into bow width blocks, first the sapwood and then the two heartwood blocks alongside it. So the wood is now cut into a single growth ring on the left, sapwood, heartwood and firewood. These are then cut further, leaving the single growth ring on the left again, 5 laminations of sapwood, 5 laminations of heartwood, another 5 laminations of heartwood and the firewood on the right. The next stage is to cut and splice a pair of lemonwood tapers. Frequently lemonwood is only available in shorter lengths, and by cutting and splicing it you actually match the wood in the top and bottom limb, which makes a much better balanced bow than if it were a full length piece. So this is in actual fact no bad thing. We cut a taper on the circular saw and then cut another piece alongside it so that the two pieces come out of the same section of log. Having cut the tapers, we then mark them top and bottom so we know which way around the bow is going to be, and then mark onto them the V-splice that we're going to cut and glue. Below the marked one you'll see a finished one. Carefully using the bandsaw, we follow the marked line removing the waste material. And then we carefully dress the cut until the V-splice is a near perfect fit. And once the two pieces have been put together, even dry, they stay together. We have several racks of laminations in the workshop that have been prepared well in advance of when we're going to use them, so that they're thoroughly dried and cured. The next stage is to machine the wood to an accurate, parallel, smooth finish, which is done using a sander thicknesser. Each piece of wood is measured so that we know how much of each material we've got going into the bow, which will determine the final draw weight of the finished item. Glue is carefully prepared and mixed, and this is done not necessarily according to the manufacturer's instructions, but to a somewhat wetter mix, and there are good reasons for this. Many of the woods we're using aren't that easy to glue, and we've developed a gluing method that works very well indeed, such that we've never had a lamination delaminate along its glue line. Hickory in particular is awkward because it loves moisture, so if you mix the glue according to the manufacturer's instructions, you tend to get an over dry glue line because the hickory will suck the moisture out of the glue. To prevent this happening, we mix the glue wetter than is recommended, and then we seal the glue and the bow using parcel tape to keep the air off it. This retards the gluing time. So we align the laminations on the former, wrap it in parcel tape, and then when it's all secured in place, we wrap it again using rubbers to apply a constant pressure during the curing process. Once the bow has been glued onto the former, we allow it a minimum of 48 hours to cure before we remove the rubbers and remove the bow from the former. It'll be a further 48 hours after that that the bow is cut out, sanded to shape and tillered. By this time the bow should have thoroughly cured, although not be 100% dry as yet. So we unwrap the rubbers from the bow, remove the bow from the former, and it will then have a further 48 hours to cure before any more work is carried out on the stave. This gluing and curing time is not a job that can be rushed. So normally we'll be gluing bows up 1 week that we won't be tillering until the following week. Once the bows come off the former, we clean off the glue on the back of the bow in particular, because as it dries it becomes razor sharp. So while it's still very slightly soft, we can easily sand it off, leaving the stave much easier to handle. Once the stave has thoroughly cured for a further 48 hours, we can start to mark it out. So we mark out the centre line and the handle area, and then using a template we mark out the profile of the back of the bow. This is then very carefully cut out using the bandsaw, removing the excess material and cutting obviously outside of the line we've marked. Once the stave has been cut to width, we use another template to mark out the handle profile and remove the excess material from the riser block. Having cut the bow out on the bandsaw, we now smooth the saw cut on the sander to leave a smooth, even edge to the bow, making sure that we retain the marked out pencil line on the stave. This is about the last time that we can use a machine usefully in the production of a longbow. After this, all of the work is done by hand. We put the bow back into the vise, remark the handle area so that it's clear to see. And then, using a combination of rasp, scraper, file, we rough shape the bow into a D section, rounding the edges of the hickory and shaping into the handle area of the bow. With practice and experience, this doesn't take too long, and we can make sure that the stave is smooth and even, there are no hollows in the wood, and when we start to tiller it, there are no nasty shocks. The finished stave is now rounded, the handle tapers nicely into the riser, and we're ready to start tillering the bow. Tillering a longbow is quite a delicate process. Fred Bentley here is Bickerstaff Bow's main bowyer, and when he's presented with a stave from downstairs, the first job he does is to check it, measure it, mark it out for length, and then cut the temporary nocks that we use whilst tillering the stave. As in all processes, we measure twice, cut once, to avoid mistakes. The temporary groove is cut in with a round file at roughly 45 degrees along the side of the stave and across the back, cutting slightly into the hickory. As this isn't a nock that's going to be used for shooting the bow, we can take slightly more liberties with it than we would if it was an actual string nock. We fit an overlong string onto the stave so that the bow isn't under any stress initially when we put it onto the tiller, and we'll bend it a small amount, looking for stiff bits. And the art of tillering is very, very simple. If it's too stiff, remove material. If it's bending too much in an area, remove wood everywhere else, until the stave bends into the shape that you're looking for. And this is where art meets science. The bow has to bend properly as a spring and be evenly tensioned throughout its length and bend into the arc of a circle. so it's a question of being able to see shapes. What Fred's doing at the moment is carefully looking to see which are the stiff areas and marking those, and he'll remove wood from those areas and leave everywhere else alone. And you keep gently removing material until the stave adopts the shape you're looking for. Having marked the stave, whilst on the tiller, we can now confidently scrape and remove material, knowing roughly how much material needs to be removed to bring the shape back into line. In this shot you can look down the length of the bow and you can get a better idea of where we're marking the stave, how much material's likely to be removed, and you can see here it's a little bit stiff above and below the handle. This is quite normal, and most staves we don't rush to remove material into this area until the bow's very much taking shape. So as it gets closer to being finished, we're happier to work closer and closer into the handle and to get the limb to bend throughout almost all of its length. As the bow nears completion, we usually get a colleague, in this case Richard, is helping Fred, gently exercising the bow so that Fred can see the bow as it dynamically bends rather than as a static bend held on the tiller. You can sometimes pick out a little bit more detail by seeing how the bend develops as the bow is drawn. With practice, as you can see, the scraper that we're using here is being held very, very lightly, and the bow is almost being polished, so that by the time we finish tillering it, it needs very little sanding. And here we see the bow almost completely finished. When Fred has finished tillering the bow, he hands it on to Richard. Richard will then sand the bow. Having sanded it, he'll check the draw weight, and then he'll mark it to length for the final fitting of the horn nocks, which he then drills. You'll note we're using a tapered drill bit so that we get a tapered hole in the horn. The end of the bow will be tapered to match, and we'll have a rough knock for the top and the bottom. The ends of the bow are usually slimmed down such that they run smoothly into the taper, and the horn knock fits onto that taper without any loose movement, so that you get a strong, firm fit with no gaggle. Once we're happy with the fit, glue is applied into the horn. We use an activator on the wood, which helps the glue to penetrate into the fibres of the timber, and the horn is glued onto the end of the bow. When the glue's had time to cure, excess horn is trimmed off on the bandsaw. We then shape the horn into the familiar shape of the horn knock, and this is all done using files, rasps, scrapers, sandpaper. We can sometimes do a little bit of additional shaping using the roller on the end of a belt sander. And then we pre-cut a piece of horn which we're going to insert as an arrow plate, marking carefully round it with a sharp knife. We've then got a clear mark on the bow where we can gently chisel a shallow pocket for the horn to be glued into. This is a fairly careful and delicate job, and once the horn and the pocket are a good fit, we can glue the horn into the pocket, and as you can see there's a large lump of excess horn there which we can trim off and use to make another horn knock in another bow later. The horn in the bow is then filed such that it fits smoothly into the bow, leaving a slight rounded projection to keep the arrow always running on the arrow plate and never on the wood. This is sanded in to leave a perfect fit. We finally shape and finish the limb tips and the horn nocks together. They're then sanded. String groove is cut into the horn knock. And then we'll cut a stringer groove above the string groove itself so that all of our bows can be strung using a stringer. And that's the knock fitted to the bow. The next stage is to label the bow. All of our bows are labelled by hand using an ink pen. So we seal the wood first, and then we can use a calligraphy pen to write onto the wood. We seal the wood with a glue so that the ink doesn't run into the fibres of the wood and produce a smudgy finish. When the ink has thoroughly dried, we then seal over that, and then the bow can be varnished. There are many different ways of varnishing bows, and initially the first few coats are rubbed on with a cloth and buffed up, and that produces a very acceptable finish. The next job is to cut and fit a leather grip. All of our grips nowadays are hand stitched onto the bow, and on the back of the bow we make a series of little pads of leather which give the grip a much more comfortable feel in the hand when you're shooting the bow. We use a simple template which has got a series of holes marked in the end and a curved edge. We roll the top and bottom edges of the grip over so that you get a clean edge, and we do that using a double-sided adhesive so that the leather stays in place while we stitch it onto the grip. Once the grip has been fitted to the bow, we're ready to stitch it on. And to do this, we use a strong nylon thread and a stitch pattern that we've developed over the years that holds the grip firmly in place and looks reasonably neat and tidy. There are probably thousands of different ways of fitting grips onto bows, but we've settled on one that we're comfortable with. Most of the customers seem to like the style of grip we use. They look smart and they last. You'll be able to see underneath the grip the labelling which gives the bracing height, the draw weight, the draw length and the bow length. All useful bits of information you may need to refer to later. On all of our bows we fit a double loop laid in fast light string. Every string is handmade, and the first job in making any string is to spool out the right number of strands for the draw weight of the bow. We then trim off the strands at the end so that when we lay in the loops, the loose ends of the material feather out smoothly into the laying in. To make things a little bit easier to see, we're going to do a black and white string for this bow, and then you'll be able to see the two halves of the string more clearly as it's laid in. The first job is to lay in the loop. You twist to the right, lay to the left, and you lay in enough material that when you fold it back you've got a big enough loop to go around the end of your bow knock on the bow. You don't want too big a loop, otherwise the string's a little bit too gappy. Laying the loop into the main body of the string is exactly the same again. Twist to the right, lay to the left. And just keep going and going and going and going. You lay in twice as much as you need at one end of the string, so that when you lay the other loop in at the far end of the string and lay back into the string, it undoes one end as it lays in at the other. Having laid in the end of the string, we straighten up the fibres and comb them through so that they're going to lay smoothly together when the string is finished. And it's important to get these excess bits of twist out of the fibres at this stage. Once you've formed the second loop, you're committed. We measure the exact length of the bow along the back, hooking the tape into one string knock and measuring down to the string knock at the other end. This length is always recorded on the bow, so when you need to order a replacement string, all you need to do is quote information that's actually printed onto the bow length and the draw weight. From that we can make a string that'll fit. Here Richard's trimming the fibres to length in a random fashion so that they don't all finish at the same point when we lay in the second end of the string. Again, you lay the loop in first, having preset the jig to the correct length. You then hook the loop around the post and twist to the right, lay to the left, twist to the right, lay to the left, until you've laid in the same length at each end of the string. As you're laying in at this end, it undoes at the other end, which is why you laid in an excessive amount of twist to start with. Having laid both ends in, you now rub the string with wax and then rub the wax into the string with a piece of leather. This allows all the fibres to bed in together and then we will put the serving onto the centre of the string. So you wind the serving tool over the end of the serving to trap it onto the string, trim off the excess, and then continue winding in the same direction. The serving is always put on, wound in the same direction as the laying in, and we have a clever little machine that spins the string while we hold the serving tool still. That puts the serving onto the string at constant tension. We then finish off the end of the string by winding inside the loop and then wind the loop over the loose end of the string until you have just one small loop to pull back through, pull it tight, and that's the serving finished.